I am joined today by Scott Lamb, President of the Conservative Party of Canada. By day, Scott is a Vancouver-based lawyer and partner with Clark Wilson. And by night and weekends, he helps the Conservative Party navigate one of the most interesting times in our history. Today, we're going to talk about party politics, the future of the Conservative Party, and his role in the conservative movement. So thank you for being on the show today, Scott. We are going to spend some time talking about the politics as a business, I think, is kind of the theme we're going to spend time on. But I do want to talk about your role as a party member, as the president of the party. I want to talk about Erin O'Toole, the new party leader, and the role that the Conservative Party has right now in this current environment. We have a minority government that could be in place for up to another 3 years, maybe not. So we're going to spend some time talking about all those things.
Sounds great.
So let's start off by being party president. I mean, the thing that first struck me is when Teiko Van Popta, one of the MPs and members of the Conservative Party, who introduced you to me and said, let's get Scott on the show. I said, oh, when's he flying out here next? And he said, no, he lives here in Vancouver. Because I just made the assumption that you're either from Alberta or you're from Ontario.
Yes, and usually the Ontario folks tend to control a lot of the things. We wrested the presidency away from them and claimed it for Western Canada when I came on board.
So. Okay, so how long have you been president for?
4.5 years.
Okay.
And so I was elected first at the Vancouver National Convention, which I chaired, and was reelected in 2018 at our national convention in Halifax as well.
Okay. Now, is there a certain term for presidency?
Yes, and my term was supposed to be up in April.
Oh, okay.
But as you know, we had a leadership race. And because of the leadership race, we bounced our convention over to the fall. And then as we got into our leadership race, of course, we had COVID-19. And so then we bounced that from November on further. And we're going to make an announcement fairly shortly as to the precise date of our convention. And so,
unless something else comes up.
Yeah, it just seems one thing after another in the last while.
Yeah. Okay, so tell me a bit more about what are the basic responsibilities and because I would say that a lot of our listeners likely, like myself,
right,
we're well familiar with the Conservative Party. Many, I'm sure, of our listeners even vote for the Conservative Party, donate to the Conservative Party. But they only think about the Conservative Party, like myself, in terms of like who the MPs are that represent that party. And maybe they're obviously the philosophies of the Conservative Party, but never thought about like the people behind it, like yourself, the president. So
right.
What's your responsibility here? And how does that contrast with Erin O'Toole?
The way I like to describe it is our party constitution is set up as a three-legged stool.
Okay.
So on the one hand, you have the leader of the party and the caucus, the MPs, as one leg of the stool. And then the next leg of the stool, you have the National Council, which I'm president of, and the party operations. And then the third leg is the chair of the fund, the Conservative Fund of Canada. And they're those directors which look after the financial management. They have responsibilities for that.
Oh, wow. Okay. So as far as raising money, because when we talk about the business of politics, I mean, one of the main things as anything in business is about having a good financial house in order and being able to keep the lights on.
Right.
It sounds to me like your role isn't really involved in around the fundraising aspects.
It is and it isn't.
Okay.
We have a relationship with the fund that we work closely together. And what I like to say is those three legs of those stools, if they all work well together, there's usually good success for our party. And so we work closely with the fund to ensure that we're able to raise the money for our elections campaigns and keep our party operations going.
Okay. So Scott, what are some of the types of things that you do as a party president that the average Joe like myself or the average Andrew wouldn't actually realize you do? Like, what are some of the key parts of like that?
The key things are working with the fund in terms of raising money, but it's also party operations. We're right now in a nomination cycle, so we're nominating people all across the country to run for us for our party. We form a oversight role, but also we perform an operations role. So we participate in various committees and things that we do in party operations, not just supervising. So for most people, listeners that are used to board of directors kind of roles and that sort of governance, it's a little bit different than that. We're not just purely directors of a corporation, as it were, in our role as directors of the party. We actually perform operational duties as well. It works pretty simply. We're a grassroots party. We open up the nominations, then anybody can file the appropriate documentation to run in the nomination race for a particular riding.
Okay.
So these are all starting to open up now, and we're getting people coming forward and running. So sometimes we'll get a whole bunch of people that qualify and are able to submit their documentation and get into the process. Sometimes we'll get only a few people, and our job is to try to encourage as many people to come forward as possible. But we are moving quickly because it's a minority government, and in a minority government, where the window for a lot of this recruitment is quite short.
Because you could potentially have what we have in BC right now, where the BC Liberals, who are not associated with the federal Liberals, but where the BC Liberals and the Green Party were kind of caught, I wouldn't say with their pants down, but were caught off guard with the snap election. Is that what you were talking about?
Yeah, and so there you really want to make sure you're moving forward with a lot of dispatch to do that, and that's what we're doing.
Okay.
And in the case of what happened here provincially, it was interesting to see the NDP go for an election, because they themselves actually hadn't nominated all of their candidates.
Right.
And that's usually one of the tell signs as to whether a governing party is going to actually call an election. Do they have all of their unheld riding nominees in place, their candidates in place? And if they don't, it tells you, well, they're not ready. And the other thing you're looking for is, where's the money? How are they doing in their fundraising? Are they raising lots of money? And if they've got their candidates in place, and they've raised lots of money, and their polls are looking good, you know they want to push for an election.
Wow, interesting. So that was a bit of a surprise in the sense that what you've just described as the BC NDP didn't have all their candidates. And I mean, we wouldn't, I guess, know how much money they'd raised, but it sounds like...
You would know because it's disclosed on a quarterly basis, even in BC. Yeah.
Oh, is it? I didn't know that. Federally and provincially?
Yep.
Oh,
so
wow.
Our reporting federally is quarterly, and people watch that very carefully to see how the parties are doing. Typically, in fundraising for political parties, governing parties out-fundraise opposition parties. And that's pretty much the case what's happened in BC.
Right.
The NDP has done better.
Except if you're Donald Trump these days, apparently. Yeah. Joe Biden's doing a pretty... Yeah.
Well, and in federally, the Conservative Party has been out-fundraising the Liberal Party.
Have they?
Yeah,
okay.
And we've been doing that for quite a while now.
That must be much more difficult. I mean, we could dive into that whole arena on fundraising. There were some changes in the rules. I think it was at 2017 or so. That
prior to that, we were still government, the Harper government, and even prior to that, to the Chrétien government, a series of reforms were made. Effectively, what it did was pull back the fundraising from unlimited donations to a cap, and currently that's $1,650.
Yeah.
And then preventing corporates or union donations.
Right.
So there could only be individual donations to $1,650.
So before 2017, corporations and unions could donate, and individuals, corporations, and unions could also donate fairly large sums.
Right.
But today, now it's
all capped out.
Yeah.
So the effect of that, Andrew, is it meant that the political parties in Canada have had less money to operate with.
Right.
Significantly less. Mm-hmm. And you compare that to other jurisdictions in other countries like the United States, where they're literally in this presidential and congressional election cycle spend billions of dollars. Mm-hmm. Even in the UK, they'll spend a lot more than we have here in Canada. And the ramifications...
How much do we spend in Canada?
Well, you're looking at each party's, the Liberals and ourselves, spend to the cap last time, which is about $29 million during the RIP period. And then the NDP...
Oh, there's even a cap. Even if you did raise a limitless amount of money, there's actually a cap on how much you can spend.
During what we call the RIP period, during the election period. Prior to that, there are some restrictions, but mostly it's open-ended what you can spend. So it's highly regulated and highly controlled. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that people often think that there's a building in Ottawa that's 30 stories high and has got a big C on it, and there's a cast of thousands working for the Conservative Party. Well, there isn't. And the Liberal Party has about 80 professional people working for them. We have around 60 professional people working for us, and that's it. The rest is all a massive volunteer organization,
Wow.
and which is mobilized during an election period to literally to tens of thousands of people
Incredible.
working. So it's a very much different organization. I told you a little bit about how the governing structure is a little different than your typical corporation. Well, also the actual functioning of who does all of this is a lot different because you've got a small professional staff overseeing really effectively a very large volunteer base.
Wow. Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
With these changes in the regulations on donations to political parties, effectively getting rid of foreign donations, corporate donations, union donations, and even capping donations for individuals so that wealthy people can't really donate much to a particular party, I got to assume that probably hurt the Conservative Party more than it hindered than it helped it, compared to, say, that of like the Green Party of Canada, who likely probably has mostly, not a bunch of wealthy people donating to them.
The interesting thing about that, Andrew, is actually it didn't.
It didn't?
We
Okay.
are the leading fundraising party and have been for a long time now.
Really?
What happened is that when we merged the old Progressive Conservative Party with the Alliance Party, there was a real tradition, particularly on the Alliance side, of grassroots involvement and donations. So effectively, we understood how to raise lots of money from a broad base of donors.
Okay.
And what I mean is not large donations, but lots of them from a broad base. That set us up when the reforms came through, that we were far ahead of the Liberal Party.
Interesting. Okay.
The party that was closest to us in sort of a philosophy and a culture and an operation that could fundraise was actually the NDP. And we've done extremely well in fundraising, and it's been fundraising is and leading in fundraising is a strategic advantage as much and a political advantage as much as it's just good business practice. We've had the benefit of that. I like to tell the story about how Stephen Harper succeeded as being the longest minority prime minister in Canadian history. Typically, minority governments last anywhere from a year to 2 years. His minority government lasted for 5 years. And people often say, well, how did he last so long? Well, he was a very brilliant man in terms of understanding how Parliament worked and how to get what he wanted done in a minority government. But also, he also had the knowledge that if the opposition wanted to take him down, he had more money in the bank than anybody else across the aisle did. And so it was effectively, you want to take us down? Well, we're ready to fight an election. Are you?
Right.
And so money is very important in politics, and it has direct impact ultimately on what happens sometimes in the House of Commons. And so you have to keep your eye on that.
Well, that's fascinating. I will start paying attention to that, Scott. I've often said to people I know, and my employees, my friends, we get to the right, and I think everybody should exercise the right to vote. Once every 4 years or so, provincially, federally. But look, the reality is most of our time, our vote really doesn't mean much, especially under the system we're in today, under the parliamentary system. But you vote with your dollars every day. And I think that those votes with your dollars are actually far more powerful than how you cast a ballot. I think they're both important. But things like if you have a broad swath of Conservative Party members all willing to not necessarily hit the maximum, if many of them can't afford that, but they can all donate a couple $100, goes along probably a lot more powerful than trying to encourage just a few people to convert from a Liberal vote to Conservative vote.
That's absolutely right. And what we've been able to do is reverse the typical scenario where the governing party out fundraises the opposition party. Just before I became president, we lost fundraising for the first time in 9 years in Q4 of 2015. We reversed that, and since that date, we've been out fundraising annually the Liberals. They've been much more competitive, the Liberals, but we've been managing to stay ahead of them. And that's really important when you think about another political factor is when you're in government, you have all the resources of the taxpayer-funded government dollars.
Yeah, of course. You have home team advantage
to promote yourself and get in front of the cameras and get in the news. And so it helps level the playing field if we can raise more money than they can, and we can spend that outside of the RIP period to get our message out.
Right.
Really, really important.
You mentioned, as we wrap this up this is really great. I love talking about the finance sides of this. You mentioned that the telltale signs that a governing party may be looking to call an election early is have they got their candidates all set up for various in the constituencies where they don't have an MP, that they've got their finances in place. What does it look like on that picture with the Liberals right now? Does it look like they're wanting to do this? I don't get the impression they are, but.
Well, I think, and I'm not sure when this is going to air, but if you look at what's happening, there's the raw politics of it, and then there's the preparations and getting your party ready. And you're highlighting, of course, one of the key things is how many dollars do you have in the bank to do this? Because of COVID and the reduced fundraising for all political parties, there's much more challenge there. The Liberals tend to run their party like they run the government. They're not afraid to get in debt as a party. We paid off our bank debt from the last election as of August 1st. The Liberals haven't. They like to...
So you can go into debt. That's not a problem.
Well, but you have to go back to the banks to raise that money. Yeah, to lend that money again. Yeah. And the Liberals operate their party, again, like they operate the country.
Sure.
They don't mind going deep into debt to do that. And they're just confident that one day they'll get themselves out of debt.
Oh, I see.
So
even if they haven't raised the $29 million, they'll just borrow it from the banks. And I'm sure the banks all... There's been enough backdoor deals going on in the last 12 months that they owe them a lifetime worth of loans anyway. So a bit cynical about this whole thing, so.
Yeah, the bottom line is that on the money side, I don't think the Liberals are going to be afraid of borrowing more money to fight an election.
Yeah.
Then looking at the political side,
sure.
What we've seen in a couple of the provincial elections is that sitting governments trade heavily on the COVID crisis to try to keep themselves in power. To the benefit of the Conservative Party in New Brunswick, they won, and looks like John Horgan's doing very well. So he's trading on that as well. And the Liberals federally will likely see that as a good sign that incumbent governments are going to benefit from the COVID crisis politically.
Right.
And so you can see the maneuvering in a minority government of the Liberals to maybe precipitate an election.
Yeah.
And they're not afraid of having an election. On our side, we're not afraid of having an election either. So we're moving closer to that. But you still have to watch those signs of are people being nominated? How's that fundraising going? What are those poll numbers? And then some other subtle things that people don't sometimes realize. And if you mentioned a moment ago, you're a little more cynical. Well, I can claim to be a little bit cynical too. When we watch whether the Liberals go for an election, there'll be a lot of people in their back bench who got elected in 2015. And they need to have been elected for 6 years or more, or 2 elections. So by October
of next year,
they can have their
pension. Is that where we're going with this?
Yeah. So at October next year, they'll hit their 6-year mark. So
right.
There'll be some backbenchers of the Liberal Party saying, "Whoa, slow down. Let's just wait a little bit longer."
Yeah. That part just drives me. I'm gonna dive into that some more on another podcast at some point, because the part I love that I think so ironic is when you look at the federal NDP party and they take this position of like, we're working for the regular people and not just for the super rich, right? As though somehow, the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party collect so many votes from all these super rich people. I don't know how they can get that many votes. And yet these are MPs who have, not only are they, if you look at Jagmeet Singh, the guy's making roughly around $200,000 a year, guaranteed. It's not like you don't have to worry about not getting a paycheck when you're working for the federal government. But his pension, he doesn't have it yet, but he will, and he will. the pension, people, you guys have to understand in real, private dollars, that's worth millions and millions of dollars. So.
Well, to the credit of Prime Minister Harper, when he left office, he left on the table literally millions of dollars in his pension, which he did not take.
Is that right?
To his credit, very impressive.
Yeah.
Also during his.
I guess that's not very well known.
No, it isn't. And he's not a person that would be, trying to tell people about that every day, but it's just a fact. And he also, under his prime ministership, reformed the pensions to make it closer to the private sector. So you can't collect your pension until you're 55 and this sort of thing, trying to make it a little bit more reflective of what people would expect in the private sector. Although you're absolutely right, it is not a private sector package at all.
Yeah,
it is very favorable.
Yeah, it's very lucrative.
But to some extent, I do see close and up close how hard some of our MPs work and what they sacrifice to put aside to do this job. And
look, Scott, I'm not criticizing the pension. I'm criticizing the people who claim as though they're not part of the 1%.
Yeah.
When the NDP MPs say, we're here for the little guy who's just trying to get by.
Yeah.
And I'm looking and going, well, why don't you, if you really feel that way, why don't you give up half your income and donate it to a charity? Why don't you do what Harper did and walk away from that pension? But you won't, and that's the that's where I get a little bit irked.
Yeah, no, I hear you, and
they do sacrifice. I mean, just admit the fact that you managed to get yourself into a very lucrative position, especially you've managed it, and I think it's deserved. Look, if anything, pay these people more. I mean, I almost wonder sometimes if we wouldn't have better leadership in politics if we actually gave a bit more an incentive, like have some kind of bonus structure.
I'm not sure how you'd do that, but
start cutting costs. I don't know. Now I'm going down my right wing avenue. Anyways, look, let's go back to a comment you made earlier, which is you believe that the Liberal Party is not afraid to enter into an election. They'll be willing to borrow money.
Yep. And
you guys aren't afraid to either. So that's a good segue into talking about Erin O'Toole.
Sure.
He's the new leader of the Conservative Party. And it's kind of standard that, you have an election and Andrew Scheer just didn't deliver. And so this is often a case where there's a question, should we look at changing leadership? And that happened. There was a leadership race, and there were a few people in that, and Erin O'Toole came out on top. So why don't you talk for the listeners for a minute about Erin O'Toole? I've never met him. Sure you have.
Yep.
What's he like? Is he a guy that we can get behind, that people that are supportive of the Conservative Party can get behind?
Well, the first thing I'd sort of back this up a little bit. The first thing I want to talk about is the leadership race itself.
Sure.
Despite being a shorter leadership race than we ran previously in 2017 and going through COVID, we set a record as a party for the number of people who joined our party during that process.
Really?
We ballooned up to 270,000 members. We've never been that big.
Wow.
And it's a very good sign. And we also set a record for the number of ballots cast in the leadership race itself at 170,000 ballots cast. That's the largest leadership vote in Canadian history. So that's a really good sign of a party that's very engaged and that the leadership candidates really actually did a great job of reaching out and connecting despite, again, COVID. And Erin came out on top of that, a clear and decisive win as our leader. And I think his success was in the campaign, first of all, learning how to campaign in a COVID environment, which I think may do him very well coming into a federal election with his team. But he was able to reach out into all aspects of our party and unite our party. He has quickly gathered everybody together in a focused direction. So that's the number one thing, being able to unify a party. That's what a party leader must do. And Erin's been able to do that. I think he has got all the tools to be a great prime minister with his background. He was the military, became a captain in the Air Force, flying in helicopters and rescue missions and that sort of thing. So he's got that military background and discipline. He's also a lawyer like me and practiced law on Bay Street and in corporate Canada. So he's got a great grounding in training that way. And he's been in business through his legal practice. So I think he's got a lot of the great tools outside of politics. Then he's got the background as a former cabinet minister under the Harper years. He came in the latter part of the Harper years as the Minister of Veteran Affairs. So he's got experience around the cabinet table. So he knows how this all works to be in government. So as a total package, really, I just think Erin's he's got what it takes to be the prime minister, and he's got a party that's united behind him. And so that's a very, very powerful early start to his leadership.
Well, that sounds very exciting. Thanks for that background. Parties as a whole in politics, if you don't mind me continue on this topic. So one of my observations, again, I'm not a political expert like yourself, and I'm learning a lot here, but one of my observations is it seems to, maybe this is just the Donald Trump effect, but it seems like the world has become, especially in North America, much more polarized into this world of like left and right, and sort of no middle ground. It's like families have been broken apart in the United States over this. Yep. And when I look at political parties, I see a lack of independent thought and expression of views because they have to be part of the party whip. Right. Who I think I'm assuming the word means they whip the MPs into place, make sure they vote a certain direction. Isn't there something to be said about the problems of doesn't that kind of create an environment where there's a party leader and a couple of key people, and so when you go back to your philosophy of like you're voting for your what you believe in up front, but maybe you're not because you're getting whatever the party leadership decides on, even though you might have an MP that, I don't know, pick a hot topic where you'd say, okay, well, maybe I've got some party leader who isn't supportive of that, and yet I agree with, but my local representative is supportive of it, but they can't vote in that direction. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, twofold again. Mostly, a lot of the differences are brokered out through the party to present a unified and coherent agenda and strategy to present to the Canadian people to say, this is what we're going to do as government. And we've all taken a little bit of water in our wine, and this is what we're putting forward as our agenda to go forward to govern. So that's the first thing. And I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. I think actually it's a good thing. Prevents extreme politics that we see under other systems.
Starting off at the party level first.
Right. Okay. But also your concern about the independence of MPs and their power within caucuses and their parties.
Well, just to have the right to be able to vote. Like if I was a federal, like let me just give an example. I'm an entrepreneurial, independent kind of guy.
Yeah.
I don't like having anybody tell me what to do. And I can sure as hell tell you, no matter what party I'm with, if I get voted by my constituents, it doesn't matter whether I'm independent, I'm a liberal or conservative, and I go up and I have something that I'm firmly against, I'm going to have a really hard time voting with my right hand when I know my left hand should be going up.
Yeah, there's really good basis for saying we really need to preserve that. And there's lots of strong MPs that do take that position against their own party leadership to say, this is what I believe in and I support. But it's also, there's a little bit of I'll call it like a functional analysis of this. Yeah. In the UK, it's often argued that their MPs, as opposed to in Canada, have much more independence, and you have more mavericks and colorful figures and that sort of thing, and their system doesn't seem to fall apart. It's largely the same system we have, and people wonder.
And I don't know how it's different.
Yeah,
so
and people wonder why that happens,
Sure.
And sure, there's a political culture aspect to it, but one of the biggest things is there's 650 MPs in the House of Commons in Britain.
Oh, right. Okay.
There's 338 here.
Yeah.
There are what we call safe seats in Britain that will elect a Conservative or elect a Labour person
no matter what.
No matter what. And what that means
They could be the
is,
most offensive person.
what it means is that person, when they get elected to there, is very secure in their seat in Parliament. And whatever the leadership may want to do in terms of carrots and sticks with respect to that maverick sitting in the back bench, not much you can do about it, because they're going to get elected every time.
Yeah.
And it's even to the extent in the
British
British system.
Michelle Rempel's so outspoken.
Well, a lot of our Alberta
I really
MPs
like her,
are.
actually. She's great.
She is great. And a lot of our Alberta MPs are the same way. They know they're going to get reelected. They're not fearful of that. And there's so it does encourage a little bit of sense of independence. And in the UK, it gets to the point where they actually have committees of backbench MPs. In the Conservative Party, I think it's called the 1922 Committee, and the chairman of that has actual direct influence over the cabinet and the leadership.
Fascinating.
They're never going to be a cabinet minister. They know that. They'll never be on the inside of the cabinet table. But if certain things are happening that they don't want, they have a direct line to the party leadership and the leader and the cabinet to say, no, you're not doing that. If you do, we'll revolt. And we may even vote against you, or we'll withhold our vote. So that's even with their own party. But the reason why you get that, again, is because there's lots of safe seats, and these guys don't worry about getting reelected. And that dynamic comes in their system. So I hate to say this, being a good conservative, but to address your issue and maybe encourage more independence of our MPs, we probably need more of them.
Right. Okay. I see. Fair enough. So if I'm going to run, I should make sure I'm going to run the Conservative banner. I should make sure I move to Alberta first.
If you're running a Lethbridge, you're going to get elected.
Well, I think that concept you've just described was sort of illustrated in that movie, The Darkest Hour, which was, did you watch that movie?
Yeah, it's a great movie. And it actually captures a period of history, which I've read in a couple of different sources. And actually, the latest one who wrote about that, but essentially what that whole movie was about, was Boris Johnson. And if you ever want to read Boris Johnson, he's a very good writer because he was a journalist for many years. He's a very good writer. The book's called The Churchill Factor, and a very entertaining read and very, 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 very good because it hits that moment in history where you really understand that by the decisions of a few people in literally hours, changed the course of history.
It did. Yeah. It's a fantastic movie. Okay, let's jump to the Conservative Party's role today. We could be in for an election soon. We might not see an election for 3 years from now. Is it 3 years? 2.5? 3 years? What do you see the Conservative Party's role today in this current state that we're in today, under both COVID and a minority government?
It's really, really important in a democracy where we're really in crisis in our country, dealing with a pandemic. And we talked about Churchill a moment ago. And it's important that our institutions perform as they should. Again, with Churchill, with the bombs literally falling on London, the House of Commons met regularly, despite literally being bombed. Churchill also was willing to have a confidence motion on his premiership in 1943 after some reversals militarily. He was confident he was going to win those, but he actually let his government be voted on for their record. They understood what they were trying to do was keep their parliamentary democracy alive, because that's what they were fighting about. I sometimes think that in this day and age, Justin Trudeau has no clue that actually is what his job is to maintain our institutions. His, in the spring, putting forward spending proposals and legislation that would prevent any questioning of the finance minister over the budgets for over a year and a half. Really, almost frankly, I don't want to sound too dramatic about it, but it strikes to 1,000 years of parliamentary democracy, of holding a government accountable for what they spend and how they govern us. They just wanted to pass. And they've continually reached for that.
To me, it was beyond arrogant. It was on the borderline of being almost scary.
It's dictatorial.
Dictatorial, 100%.
Yeah, no, it shows, frankly, the nature of this government and their leadership.
Yeah.
And
it's a very different Liberal government than I remember growing up as a kid. You mentioned Kar-Chan. I just don't feel like the Liberal Party today is anything close to what it was from the 1990s earlier.
Well, I'd have to agree with you. I mean, in those days, you had a finance minister that balanced the budget and purposely did so, cut taxes.
You're talking about Paul Martin.
Yeah, and kept deficits and debt low. That liberal, it does not exist in the Liberal Party today. It's the people that are behind the federal Liberal Party today are the same folks that were behind Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne, who ran Ontario for 16 years. And in running Ontario for 16 years, they ran up the world's largest subnational debt.
I didn't
know that.
Yep,
largest subnational debt in the world, greater than California, but California has 3 times the population of Ontario. And I think we probably agree California is not exactly a right-wing Dickinsonian regime. So they really didn't care about debts and deficits and financial management. And again, it's the same people that are the chief advisors to Prime Minister Trudeau. And frankly, Trudeau's father created a debt and deficit problem for our country that wasn't solved until the mid-1990s, and it cost our country dearly. Prior to the pandemic, we were heading down that path. There were no fiscal anchors. There was no.
But this
plan.
has accelerated it.
Absolutely, and it's given, frankly, them cover to spend as they wish for their friends and whatever their favorites are. We saw that in the WE scandal, where they were prepared to hand over $1 billion to their friends in that charitable organization to try to run something that should not have been run by them. They were in no position to do that. There's a lot of politics to play, and the NDP become a very, very key part of that.
They sure do.
Andrew, I think you have to watch. And
I mean, the throne speech was upheld by Jagmeet Singh and the NDP, so there was no,
and you have a lot of history repeating itself, not only with the vast spending of the government, which is very similar to what Justin Trudeau's father did in the 1970s. You also even have the example of his father having a minority government propped up by the NDP. That happened in 1972 to 1974. And a lot of the vast spending under the Pierre Trudeau years was right in those years. And the same thing's happening again. Andrew, we know how this movie ends. I just hope we can stop it before we get there.
Right, yeah. It's like watching the Titanic and you actually see the iceberg.
Yeah.
Scott, to finish this up, I'm going to ask you 2 questions. One is, do you have a prediction? I'm going to ask you to make a prediction on when you could, if you had to drop $5 on a bet, when do you think we could potentially see an election before 3 years from now? And who do you think is going to make that happen? You guys, or the Liberals, or the NDP?
I think ultimately we're going to oppose the current government. The key thing is who's going to prop them up.
Okay.
And it's the party that's going to do that is going to be the NDP. And the NDP is going to squeeze the federal Liberals for all the spending they can get. And at some point, the federal Liberals will say, enough's enough. We can't do anymore. And then the NDP will say, okay, we're voting with those guys to take you down. And that will be the moment that it happens.
So your prediction is that likely it would be the NDP who end up being the ones to take down the government, not the Conservatives. Because you already want to. You're ready to go.
The votes are lined up with ourselves and the Bloc to vote against the government.
Okay.
It's just whether the NDP will withdraw their support. And
they've got as they call it, the balance of power, so to speak.
And as much as the Liberals will get tired of just giving the NDP more and more money for their pet projects. At a certain point, the NDP also is going to be tired of propping up the government because, frankly, we'll be just looking at them and saying, why are you propping up this government? This government is refusing, as we're currently seeing in the media, from allowing any examination
of the WE scandal.
Of the WE scandal.
Yeah, and it's a great point, Scott.
Yeah, and so at some point, the NDP are going to look themselves in the mirror and say, why are we supporting these people? Mm-hmm. We have to say no at some point to them. Yeah. And when they do that, we'll get an election.
So you answered the second part of my question, which is you suspect it'll be the NDP who are going to be the ones who end up calling the election. Do you have any sense of, like, if you could just pin $5, we won't hold you to it. I mean, but if you had to put $5 down, when do you think that could happen?
Wow, that is a tough question. That really, honestly, is a tough question because
what's the earliest we could see that happen?
Next week.
Really?
Yeah.
Realistically, though, next week, not likely, right?
Well, I mean, we can get back to the question of why would the NDP want to pull them down now?
Sure. How's their fundraising been?
Terrible. So
do they have candidates in every riding?
No.
Okay, so they're probably not going to be keen to do that.
They're not going to be that keen. They also probably see the polls, and the polls would show that they'll probably be very lucky to hold the seats they have, and they're more likely to lose seats to both ourselves and to the Liberals.
Yeah.
The NDP is in a moment in its history where it's been really stretched. Frankly, I believe that we will take a lot of their rural seats, and the Liberals will take a lot of their urban seats. The NDP has transformed itself from a long way from its original roots as a cooperative movement in Western Canada.
Yes, sure has.
Yeah, long
My
way.
Great-grandmother was actually one of the founders of that.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, I was born and raised until I got to high school in Alberta. So a lot of my family's from Alberta, and I have a lot of cousins in Saskatchewan. And it was, you tell people in Eastern Canada this, but it's hard for them to understand. But I said, well, my relatives, they had either vote for, in Saskatchewan, they had vote for the NDP or they'd vote for the Conservatives. Mm-hmm. They'd never vote for the Liberals.
Right.
Liberals were the big fat cats in Eastern Canada.
That's right.
Never vote for them.
Yeah.
And I always say to people, growing up in Alberta, of course, no one voted for the Liberals growing up in Alberta. I said the first time I ever met Liberals was I moved to Vancouver.
Well, this has been great. Scott Lamb, President of the Conservative Party of Canada. I wish you and your party the best of luck.
Thank you.
It's been really insightful for me, and I'm sure a lot of listeners are going to enjoy listening to this because it's a really interesting conversation about the sort of backside, the business of politics. So I appreciate you coming and talking with us today.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I'll do it anytime.
Yeah,
good
great.
to see you.
Good, thanks.